The problems go, but they come back with interest, and you can get hooked on anything that does that. Instant relief, but long-term amplification. And that's also the core problem with our sustainability crisis too, that we're seeking short-term benefits, whether it's the short-term quarterly returns and the bonuses and things, but in a way that creates long-term harm. There's a saying that one of the secrets of happiness is not so much having what you want, it's wanting what you have. How do we live lives that we say, yeah, this is going well? And how can we have the experience of thriving or even flourishing when we're facing extreme adversity?
Welcome to Straight Talk, where we cut through the BS and get straight into real conversations with some of the best minds on the planet, accelerating our awareness of the biggest issues impacting our lives and the future of humanity. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. It's Af Malhotra, wherever you are in the world, in whatever order. I'm thrilled to have you on the show once again. I have an incredible guest with me today, and it's funny because the guest today is a fantastic, prolific author and has released this book that was referred to me by a close relative of mine who happens to be a doctor. And him and I were sitting down a while ago, probably over a year ago, talking about hope, talking about this idea of, we live in hope and we hope that the world will be better. And we were figuring out whether hope is enough or we need to take action and we need to have hope and action. And we're having this excellent debate. And then my cousin pulled out this book called Active Hope. He said, you must read this. Look at this book, Active Hope. And I've got it here. And I have been told that there's a new version, so you will buy the new version. Active Hope with this sort of a subtext, which is, how to face the mess we're in without going crazy. Sounds very, very true to life. It's by Joanna Macy and Chris Johnstone. And today I have the wonderful Chris Johnstone on the show. Chris, thank you for coming on Straight Talk. What a pleasure it is to have you here with me today.
Thank you, Af. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Excellent. So we're going to dig as deep as we can and pick that brain of yours with so much knowledge and wisdom and tools and techniques and approaches that can help us become more resilient, that can help us deal with some of this crazy uncertainty and chaos. And of course, in the world we live in right now, this moment, there is so much coming our way. And I'm sure you've seen this, war, an economic crisis once again, inflation, the pockets of those who struggle the most have just been shorted. I mean, we see people who are struggling with the cost of living here in the UK, especially, and in Europe and in other parts of the world. In the workplace, we're seeing the great resignation play out. Loads of people leaving their jobs, which was, the outcome of COVID, when people had a realization of some sort to say, well, actually, I don't want to sign up to this way of doing things. There's the quiet quitters who have now been discovered, who are disinterested in work, sort of just carrying on. They are the 86% of the Gallup survey that doesn't really want to go to work every day. We've got organizations dealing with the future of work, like this mobile environment where we're doing, Zoom calls and Teams calls. And that's how you're managing people now, like just above the chest. That's how you know people. I mean, I was at a corporate today and I discovered that this corporate, some of the leaders and managers haven't actually even met some of their employees. Today was the first day after 6 or 7 months they've met some of their workforce, their teammates. Unbelievable. And it got me thinking. I just thought, well, in the old days, when I say old days, I'm talking 3 years ago, pre-COVID, we had privileges because we used to meet people face to face. We used to communicate face to face. We used to transmit energy, pick up body language, draw from one another. And now you've got to find this virtual world and make it your default without choice, and figure out how you can exist in it and be as effective and productive, whether you're a leader, you're a manager, you're part of the team. And resilience, making friends with uncertainty, dealing with upheavals, the unknown, is, I would say, at its peak to some extent, of course, compared to yesteryears. So today is all about, trying to figure out and learn from you as to what are you seeing out there as being the new set of approaches that can address and help us deal with this uncertainty, to be more resilient, because we're all desperately trying, but it's not easy. And of course, you've told me that you've got a new version of the book that I highly recommend our Straight Talkers purchase and buy. And I also want to ask you, well, let's start with, tell me why you've got another version of the book. Wasn't this one powerful enough? I thought it was brilliant, but there's obviously something special about the new book. So let's start with that. And then we'll have an open dialogue. We'll just, navigate through this pathway ourselves.
Yes, it's so helpful hearing you, Af, and because what you've described are some of the difficulties that people face. And the fact that there's a sense that what we face now, you talked about the old days of over 3 years ago, pre-COVID, but there's many ways our world is changing. There's a war in Europe. There's a climate catastrophe is kind of more real to people, with weather extremes, floods and droughts and wildfires. And research, when they do surveys, they ask people, do you feel the future we're heading into is getting better or worse? A big majority feel it's getting worse. And so the subtitle of our book, How to Face the Mess We're In. That's what we look at, how to face the mess we're in. And we changed the subtitle. We brought a new edition out last year, which was like the 10th anniversary edition. We're just thinking 10 years on, things have changed so much. It's not just COVID, but other areas too. And one of the biggest changes is a sense of loss of hope in the future. That people looking at the future we're heading into, there was a survey done of young people, over 10,000 young people from many different countries, and the majority of them agreed with the statement that humanity is doomed. And if you look into the future and you have that sense that we're on a downhill slope of decline, things are going to get more difficult, it's heart sinker. We live at a time of rising levels of depression and anxiety, has big impacts on mental health, but it also is this sense of, how do I invest in the life I'm living in now? How do I put in effort if I don't feel that I'm actually going to lead to what I really hope for? And you talked about the great resignation, the quiet quitters, people stepping back from the workforce. But that's also happening in schools as well. It's happening in education. People saying, well, if we're going down the tubes, what's the point? And it may sound like a gloomy place to begin, but I'm a great fan of adventure stories like, Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, but I'm also been deeply involved in well-being, work for well-being, really for about 40 years now. I'm in my early 60s now, and I got involved in the well-being movement as a medical student in the early 1980s. And so it's a big interest for me. It's like, how do we live lives that we say, yeah, this is going well? And how can we have the experience of thriving or even flourishing when we're facing extreme adversity? And I work, my work around resilience is really being alongside people facing difficult situations and looking at, how do I face this in a way where I'm contributing to an upslope of recovery, rather than just saying, well, there's nothing I can do. And so in a way that the resignation can also be part of the downslope, because what you lose with resignation is also meaning and purpose in life, which are key factors for well-being. People who have a strong sense of meaning and purpose in life, they not only tend to sleep better at night, have better mood, better physical health, they tend to live longer as well. And so there's these two different kind of streams that I'm wanting to bring together here. One is about personal well-being. How do we have good lives? How do we have lives rich in meaning, sense of vitality, sense of meaningfulness in our lives? At the same time as this question, how do we face the mess we're in? Because there's a big mess going on. And one of the things we did with the new edition is that we changed the subtitle. We changed the subtitle. It used to be How to Face the Mess We're In Without Going Crazy. Now, actually, a lot of people are facing the mess we're in, but they're feeling completely
Correct.
sunk by it. It's like, how do I even look at this without sinking into depression or feeling charged up with anxiety? How do I sleep at night? And so the new subtitle is How to Face the Mess We're In with Unexpected Resilience and Creative Power. Now,
Wow. Okay. Please go
you're
ahead.
nodding, and I'm just wondering how that's landing with you. So, if you is that something attractive to you? Unexpected
Yeah.
resilience and creative power.
Yeah, I mean the unexpected resilience is interesting. The way I read into that, of course, and this is all unscripted. So we're having a dialogue right now, straight talk right now. For me, unexpected resilience is really about surprising yourself to some extent, where you end up being resilient when you thought you couldn't. So it's like you shock yourself, where you're like, really, I got through this. How did I get through this? And it's a moment of, I mean, almost a type of breakthrough, I would say. That's how I read, with a positive growth mindset. I read unexpected resilience to be that. Creative power, that's really two very interesting words coming together. It's nice that you've put creative with power, because being creative means you have accepted that you've got to try and do things differently, and the status quo won't work, and what worked yesterday won't work tomorrow, for example. And so you accept that I've got to think out of the box. I've got to, like in India, there's a term which is very popular, jugaad. And jugaad is basically creativity, inventiveness, where, well, a normal product won't work. I've got to fudge it and figure out how I can still get the same outcome. And it doesn't have to be expensive. It can be super quick, it can be pragmatic and practical. So that's how I read it. And I'm intrigued because I want to know more. So tell me more about this unexpected resilience. What does it actually mean, and what's your thinking around it?
Yeah. First of all, I just want to say I love what you've got it. I'm so pleased we're recording this, because what you got with unexpected resilience has that sense of maybe I can surprise myself. And when I
Right.
teach resilience courses, I work a lot with self-talk. Self-talk is like, how do we speak to ourselves? What are the little phrases? So when we're in a tight corner, the little phrase going, maybe I can surprise myself,
Mm.
leads in a different direction to, this is just so awful. That there are things that are just so awful. And I work a lot with acceptance and commitment therapy. It's an approach to therapy proven to be helpful in treatment of depression and anxiety. But actually, I just love the title, Acceptance and
Mm.
Commitment Therapy. And I have this equation, A plus C equals T. So when you can approach a situation with acceptance, is not about approval, it's more about acknowledgement. I'm taking in the reality of what's going on. When we were talking before we started, you talked about climate
Yeah.
realism being part of the brief of Straight Talk. So accepting, we face what we face, we feel what we
Mm.
feel, but then we have choices about how we respond. And that's where the commitment comes, because our choices are guided by our values, by what's important to us.
Mm.
And
Mm.
I love hope as a directional signal. Like, whatever you face, it can go different ways. And in some of the resilience work, I draw on the Penn Resilience Program developed at the University of Pennsylvania. They ask three questions. They say, whatever you face, ask, what's the best that can happen here? What's the worst that can happen here? And what's most likely to happen here? And I teach
Mm.
that with the hand. One of my uh, Lynn, a woman on one of my courses, she taught me this. She did it with school children. She said, you look at your hand, you say, what's the best? You stick your thumb up at that. What's the worst? It's important to consider. If we didn't consider the worst, we wouldn't have fire drills. We wouldn't have fire
Right.
preparedness. You think of the worst that can happen, and then you seek ways to make that less likely or less harmful. And so it's
Right.
about risk awareness. So what's the worst? What's the best? What's most likely? But don't stop there. With active hope, you're saying, what do I hope for? And how do I be active in making that more likely? So,
Mm.
okay, so in terms of looking at this, okay, what's the best? What's the worst? What's most likely? Active hope is about how we how we play a role in the story of
Mm,
making our hopes more likely.
mm, mm. It reminds me of this sort of time when, and you know, everyone goes through different phases in their lives, and whether it's work life or home life and so on. And it reminds me of this time where, you know, I personally went through a lot of health trauma, and have been for many, many years. And what trauma does, as you know, it can recalibrate you. You know, it can recalibrate you. It can transform you in so many different ways. Once you've got through it, of course, while you're in the thick of it, you don't really have time for reflection or connecting the dots. But I think later on, through the passage of time, you have this ability to reconsider, reflect, and introspect, and so on. And when you talked about earlier on, you were talking about these questions, and it might seem terribly simple for a lot of people, what you've just said. But let me just reinforce that point. Throughout my course of illness and difficulties and ups and downs in life, funnily enough, I do use those three questions all the time, all the time. Just most recently, there was something that happened in my work life, and I usually actually start with the worst case scenario, not because I'm negative. I just say, right, if I can accept, to your point, the worst case scenario, I'll immerse myself in it for a bit, then fine. I mean, that's like the worst that can ever happen. So like, don't overthink it, because we have a habit, don't we, of over exaggerating situations in our minds. And so I do that all the time just to reinforce what you're saying. And then, of course, the best case, which is amazing, and then the likely case. And of course, do you often find that, I mean, not everyone can do this, but it reminds me of scenario planning, the old sort of scenario planning technique that Shell developed, and then, of course, was shared with the rest of the world, where you actually have some probabilities against it. That kind of helps sometimes to say, well, what's the likelihood that it's going to be really bad? Or am I just like making this stuff up in my head? How do you see, I mean, is that also a dimension of it that you see being used by people?
Yeah, and we do this all the time. It's looking into the future, and the psychological term for this is prospecting. Prospecting, you know, you can
Prospecting.
have
Okay.
you can have introspection, looking inside, but prospection is where you're kind of looking forward and you're considering different possibilities. And
Yeah.
two common ones are hopes and fears. So hopes is around, you know, what do I hope for? What are some of the better ways it can go? Not necessarily the best, but maybe that would be quite good, or even that would be better than that. And so,
Mm,
what are some of the better ways this can go? And this is really about pathways thinking, thinking about different possible pathways into the future. Um, but also, yeah. So there's different routes that we can follow, but then it's also saying, what's my role in this? What's my
mm,
role in this? And you ask, what do I mean by unexpected resilience, and to draw that out a bit more. And one of the things is just recognizing that maybe we can surprise ourselves. That when we hear the "what's the worst that can happen" voice and get stuck on that, it's called awfulizing. Awfulizing is where our mind gets kind of stuck on. I think of it the lower leg,
mm.
you know, the kind of worst possibility, and you can kind of have a inner video in your brain going, because of this, therefore that. And when this happens, it will lead to that, and then it will lead to that. So you have this kind of chain of events in your
Mm,
mind that goes from
mm,
bad to worse, and that's fear. So yes, we do this scenario planning all the time, thinking about what are some of the
right.
different ways things can go. It's a kind of natural thing, but also
Yeah.
sometimes it's scorned, it's looked down upon, because if you think about the best, you're seen as just a dreamer. And if you think about the worst, you're accused of being a worrier. And so some people say, oh, we should think more positively. But actually, what psychology, the kind of advances, is kind of a step ahead of positive thinking, is the term is flexible thinking. Flexible thinking, and I think it's like we have flexible necks, so you can kind of look up and you can look down and you can look around. And we've
Right.
got flexible necks because it's got survival advantage. But we can do the same
Yeah.
with our thinking. We can look up and say, hey, what's the best? What's the
Mm,
worst? Look down. You know, if you were walking across a floor that was strewn with things that you could trip over. You want to be looking down
Mm.
and be aware of the things that you can trip over. If you always look up and say, let's look on the bright side, you might end up tripping over risks that you had kind of taken out of view. So there's value in both
Mm.
views, but it's the flexibility is the thing. It's being able to
Mm.
move. And so in scenarios, one of the key things here is recognizing that we don't know. We don't know how things will go. Joanna Macy,
Correct.
amazing woman that I co-wrote Active Hope with. She's 93 now, amazing elder
Wow.
teacher, important mentor for me. She uses this term radical uncertainty. And radical
Mm.
uncertainty is about just acknowledging our deep not knowing. And why that's important as we face this time, here we are, early 21st century, is it
Mm.
challenges the view either that everything will be fine, that we don't need to worry, which is basically unscientific. It's an unhelpful view, and it's really about blocking our eyes from the very real risks that we face. But there can be another false certainty, just as you can have false hope, you can also have false hopelessness, where things are seen
Right.
to be so bleak that there's no point doing anything. And I really learned a lot about this from working alongside people living with cancer. And some of them have been
Mm.
told by their doctors that there's no hope. You might as well basically pack your bags. There's nothing you can do. And this idea
Mm.
that there's nothing you can do is actually so unhelpful, because you may not
Correct.
be
Yeah.
able to do things that cause an unexpected remission, although unexpected, medically unexplained remissions do occur in cancer. It's not unknown. And it's very interesting phenomena. People who have been told that you've only got so long to live, and then they're still going strong 5 or more years later. Um,
Yes. Yes.
but challenging this sense of I know what's going to happen and it will be awful. And the truth is that between the best and the worst, there's a whole spectrum of what's possible, and we can influence which way it goes. We don't control, but we do influence. And every day we have choices that can support either one version or a different version of reality.
Mm.
It's like where we choose to invest our
Mm.
money, what we choose to buy, how we choose to travel, what kind of
Mm.
focus we choose to have in our life. And I think of this as a holistic democracy where every choice point is like a vote. And what we write about in Active Hope is this idea that we live inside stories, and one story is the optimistic story that everything's fine and we don't need to change, and we call that business as usual. And it's
Mm.
misleading,
Mm.
and it's taking us in a very dangerous direction. But another
Mm.
story is, we call it the Great Unraveling, and it's the story that everything is just getting worse and worse. It's all falling apart. And while
Mm.
there is evidence to support the view that unraveling is happening in our world, if you look at the species becoming extinct, we look at the weather disturbance, we look at the mass migrations of people displaced by war or climate change, we're living in very disturbing times. But
Mm.
also there's a third story, which is about recognizing that yes, there is business as usual, and sometimes I live in that world. Sometimes I go about my daily business as I usually do. And there are also sometimes I get sunk. I watch the news, or I read some article, or I watch some YouTube video, and I think, yikes, what are we heading for? It just seems like we're heading over the edge of a cliff. And so I know the great unraveling, and I know business as usual. But there's a third story where we see both of these and say, I'm not going to give either of these stories the last word. That these stories are the starting point, they're the opening chapter. But where we go from here is really, it's about what do we choose to put ourselves behind. And it's a
Right.
story we call the Great Turning. And the Great Turning is like, well, a lot of great stories. I mentioned earlier on, I love Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, and all that stuff. And what makes great stories are turning points where
Mm.
initially it seems really bleak, and along the way it changes in ways that new things become possible. And that happens in our lives too. You've been through experiences of extreme hardship with illness, and I don't know how it was for you, Af, but I'm wondering whether there might be times where you thought this is never going to improve, where there's times where you might have thought, I'm never going to find a way through this. And I learned so much from my work in the addictions recovery field, where I was working with people who'd completely lost hope of getting better. Where someone told me, he said, Chris, I've given up giving up because every time I try, I fail. And he was in what I call the stage of disbelief, stage of just not
Yeah.
believing that it could ever get better. But then months later, I saw the same person and he was like a number of months dry and he'd turned a corner. So these turning points, they can happen in
Mm,
real life too. And the
mm,
great
mm.
turning is, how do we face the mess we're in and take part in a story of turning, this idea that crisis
Mm,
can become turning point. Now,
mm,
I got more to say on this, and I love the idea of living from a good story. You know, when we have our
mm.
heart in the story that we give ourselves to, it energizes our lives. It gives us a
Sure,
reason for
sure.
wanting to get up in the morning. But I just want to check, how's this sounding to you so far?
No, it makes a lot of sense, and I had I had a couple of bits I wanted to add to it, and then of course let you free and share what you want to share. That's very very important. Have you seen any sort of differences in how people from different backgrounds or demographics adopt and you know practice some of what you've just shared? That would be intriguing because this concept of multi generations, where we all accept and acknowledge that different age groups behave a little bit differently for loads of reasons, the context, the forces at work at that time, the economy, technology, society, and so on. And we're all familiar with the boomers and Gen X and Gen Z, now Gen Alpha, and so on. In your work life and in all of the projects you get involved in your research, are you seeing the reactions and the responses or the anticipation ability vary across these generations? And if so, how?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I think one of the things is that when we look at the future, it looks differently depending on what age group you're in. So, for example, um, babies born in 2020 are something like 6 or 7 times as likely to experience extreme weather events and disturbance from climate change,
Mm,
including
mm,
crop failures, floods, wildfires. And, that's people born in 2020, but also people becoming adults now are looking into a future. And I experience it. Young people I work with and encounter and come on workshops I run, that sometimes I
mm,
hear anger at having a future stolen by an
mm,
older generation. And so one of the things is that there's a
mm,
inequity, a generational inequity in terms of the consequences and also causes of climate disaster, where it might seem that older generations have benefited in many ways from sort of economic
mm,
development, but at the same time in a way that's inflicting harm on future generations. And so that's one thing, but also in terms of demographics, just in terms of cost of living crisis, there's huge intergenerational inequity in terms of things like access to housing, people able to buy their own home. It
that's
depends a
right. Yeah.
lot on how old you are. That if you're a certain age, you might have got in there while you were lucky, and I count
Mm,
myself amongst those, that the conditions for me when
mm,
I was 30 years ago, I bought a flat and I was able to do
mm,
that, and interest rates were higher, but the prices were, it's a completely different ball game. And so
mm, mm,
yes, of course demographics come in, but I think also, just as with any kind of diversity, what I find so helpful is looking at what's the common ground we share. Because also, if we're going to tackle the problems, if we're going to face the mess we're in, we have to do it together. If we have
mm,
one group blaming another for the problems and you get people attack and blame and defense, what happens is that you get into a tangle of polarity and opposition rather than standing in solidarity. And so I think one of the big questions we need to ask is, do we want life to continue? Now, that may seem a stupid question. Of course, we want life to continue, but our economic policies aren't designed to support that. When we look at the question, what impact will this have on people, say, often even 10 years in the future is a long way in the future. I remember talking at a party with somebody years ago who worked in the city, and he was in a long range planning unit for a bank.
Mm-hmm.
And long range was looking as far ahead as 3 months. Now, nowadays you have computer algorithms controlling trades, and you may get, people looking even just an hour ahead, and it might seem like a long time. And some of these automated decisions can, you can get cascades of decision making happening in seconds. And so the idea that we're holding the question, how will this affect in North American native Indian tradition, the Haudenosaunee group of native people, they had this question with important decisions. They say, how would this affect the seventh generation? The seventh generation being the children of the children of the children, and so on. So like 7 generations apart. And I know that important for you being a parent, you're considering, how is it going to be for the next generation? And that's what brings us together, is like saying, well, how do we want things to be for the people who are children today, but also what about their children, and what about their children? And if we're having that kind of thinking, then whether we're 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 or 70, we might find some common ground here, because we have to stand together on this.
What worries many of us, and I've had many folks on the show, and we've been talking about this concept of conscious capitalism, or this new breed of capitalism where it's purpose over profit, or somehow they're somewhat balanced. And we haven't really figured out whether it's all doable. It's that we've had great conversations about it, and so I'm trying not to be cynical about it, because of course I have a visibility of the other side, the look into the corporation, the look into the executive, the journey of the executive, whoever it may be, their personal life, their work life. And some of it is positive, but a lot of it is also concerning, because, it's like this example. I met with a C-level executive a few months back, had some lunch with him, and we were just chatting over a bottle of wine, which is what we ended up consuming. He sort of said to me, and I was saying, leadership of tomorrow is about this conscious capitalism, and we've got to do this together. And, the things you and I are discussing right now. And he sort of stopped me, I think, when he was relaxed after a few drinks. And he said, well, let me say something to you. And I said, yeah, go on. He said, well, what makes you think that me, as a C-level executive, have the ability to switch on compassion and empathy and care and support, like you're describing it, like some sort of a, it's an imaginary book and fantasy almost. And I said, well, why'd you say that? He said, well, I don't have these things at home. You are making an assumption that I have compassion at home, love at home, consideration at home, because most of my life I've been busy with the corporate jobs. I've never been at home. So my marriage is not what it should be. My kids don't really engage with me. So how can I just come into work and turn it on? Because I don't have it. And so that's the negative side. Obviously, not every executive is in the same situation, we hope. But then I think to myself, to your point, what steps do we need to take as society to be able to affect the next few generations? Because the way I look at it sometimes, and I'm playing devil's advocate, many of these executives, frankly, don't, like your example of the short-termism or the long view is 3 months. Many of them actually do think that way because of the next quarter, right? And the results and the bonuses, and their job will be there for 2 years, 3 years at most. If you're CEO, maybe 5 or 6. But if you're not a CEO, you're around for 3, 4 years, and then you move on and you try and do a different job. So that 4-year stint, and we figure this out, and this concept of a quarterly reporting is fundamentally flawed. I mean, these are the root causes of, I would say they're the blockers of what you and I are discussing should be the future. And how do you care about the 7th generation? I mean, a native Indian community can, because they're wired differently. They always have been wired differently, close to nature, close to spirituality, and so on. So, what do you see as being the pragmatic solution out there? I mean, you may not have an answer, but I'm
Yes.
intrigued by what you would say.
Yeah, no, this is some real core issue because it comes
Yeah,
down to, is it possible? Can we do anything? And some people would say,
correct.
you can't change the world. You know, much as I'd like to, I can't change the world. But I actually think that's such an unhelpful belief, but it's not true. If only it were true that we can't change the world, we wouldn't have climate change. We wouldn't have a mass
Mm,
extinction event happening in these times. We wouldn't have this mass rise in wildfires and floods and crop failures. And so, you know, we do have an impact. But also I want to respond to the issue of cynicism because I work with this, and it's one of the reasons why Joanna and I rewrote Active Hope, because in our first
right.
edition we talked about the Great Turning as this historical process. You know, just as we can look back at periods in history like the Scientific Revolution, the Great Renaissance, they were larger overarching changes that were included so many smaller elements that built this big picture. And that's what we need. We need a vast change that has so many different contributing elements. And we came across, certainly I came across a lot in workshops, people saying, well, it sounds lovely, sounds like a nice fairy tale, but I can't
Yeah,
see it happening. And so my reply to that is, well, do would you like it to? Do you hope it will happen? And if you hope it will happen, how can you be active in making that more likely?
right.
So that's what we mean by active hope. But let's go a step further with that, because what we did in the new edition is that we changed the emphasis from outcome to process. So outcome
Mm,
is, will this big change happen? And you can look at it with conscious capitalism. You know, will there be people moving to a triple bottom line where we're not just looking at the financial gain, we're also looking at the social gain and the ecological gain as well? You know, will that happen? Well, we can say, well, do you hope it will? And so how can we be active? But also,
mm,
what would it look like if it were happening through you today? So outcome is, will it happen? By when? Will it happen enough? But process is, what does it look like from moment to moment? What's the process of this change
right.
happening? And
Hmm.
every day we have choices that are linked to economics. You know, do I buy
Mm,
this or do I buy that? Do I travel with this way or do I travel with that way? And so what
right.
we've done is that we've talked about the great turning as having three key aspects. Well, there's a number of ways that we've written about it, but one of them is to have a great turning. The first turning is turning
Right.
up with an intention to play our part. You know, you're doing this right now, Af. You're turning up. We've set up this non-profit, this Straight Talk, because you want to
Mm,
create a conversational space to
yeah.
look at the big issues that we face. So that's turning up
Yeah.
with an intention to play your part. But also in turning up, there will be some things that you want to turn away from. There might
Yeah.
be things that I know that when I do this, I know for me, there's too much plastic in my life. I
Yeah.
try and avoid it, but even when I try and avoid it, you look at the shopping, there's still things that, like, why do they have to wrap that in plastic? Why do they have to wrap that in plastic?
Yeah.
So turning up with an intention to play my part, but I'm going to be turning away from ways of doing, being, thinking, acting, organizing ourselves that cause harm. And I'm going to turn towards that which supports the kind of future I hope for. Now, we can do that
Mm,
every day, and that what we've done is really thinking of active hope as a practice for personal and collective well-being. It's for personal well-being because when we live with active hope, there's all kinds of personal well-being benefits, like richer sense of meaning in our lives, a sense of agency, a sense of possibility, personal empowerment. There's all kinds of gains to that. Our lives actually
mm,
make more sense. But
mm,
also collective well-being, because we're recognizing that something like climate change is down to a wrong turning
mm,
on a massive scale, that we've come to over
mm,
rely on fossil fuels as a source of energy. And although
mm,
there's more energy resources have been used in the last 50 years than the whole of human history before that. But are we
Wow.
happier?
Okay.
Are we the happiest generation there's ever been? No, there's no evidence to suggest that we are. Certainly, there's some comforts that I appreciate, but in terms of levels of happiness, if anything, they're in decline. Certainly, the research seems to back that up,
Mm,
that probably people
mm,
were happier in the 1950s and 60s than in many ways than they are now. And so, this
mm,
question, well, how do you reach the people who might say, well, I haven't got any of that at home, so how can I find it in my work? I haven't got any compassion. And so
yeah.
one question would be, well, what would you really like? What would you
Yeah.
really, really like? Because actually, big bonuses and things like that, you can get more and more stuff. But there's a wonderful story of, I don't know if you've heard it, one of the Nasruddin stories. And what it was
Hmm.
is a story of a rich merchant in a marketplace. And he comes along and he holds a big bag of jewels in the air. And he says, I will give this big bag of jewels to the person who teaches me the secret of happiness, because at the moment I can't find it. He had all his jewels, but he was very unhappy. And Nasruddin came along and grabbed the bag of jewels and ran off into the distance. And then you get this
Right.
story of the merchant being furious, chasing after Nasruddin. And you can do it, you can carry this on for a long while, up a hill, down a hill, across a river, through a forest. But anyway, then Nasruddin just plants the bag of jewels in the middle of the path and hides behind a rock. And the merchant kind of comes along, sees a bag of jewels there, and there's this beaming face of happiness, you know. And so Nasruddin steps out and says, "Are you happy now?" And in a way, you talked about this executive who he's lost the real treasure of compassion in his home or her home.
Mm,
And actually, that's
mm,
the real treasure that's worth so much more than big bonuses. I call it,
mm,
so say, how do you grow treasure inside ourselves? What are the things that we really treasure? There's a story of
yeah.
King Midas who um, everything he touched turned to gold. Fantastic,
Mm,
instant wealth increase, would do very well on some economic
yeah.
report. But then he gave his daughter
Yeah.
a hug and she turned to gold as well. And so
Yeah.
we can lose the things that matter most, including this precious earth that we live on. And so, how
Yeah.
do we rediscover what really matters?
Yeah. I mean, you make a great point. I love that story, by the way. And it reminds me of a similar story, if I may. There's a man in a town, small little town, a simple life, really. He's sitting on his veranda. I think he's finished his work for the day. He doesn't have to work 9 to 5. So he's just relaxing, really, on one of those rope beds, simple life, and staring at the ceiling. And it's a funny story. So a bunch of MBAs turn up to this town for some research, and they going from house to house, and they end up at this guy's house. And so they knock on the door, and someone opens the door. Not him. He's sort of relaxing, staring at the sky. And they walk in and they say, "Hey, this is who we are." And he's like, "Oh, hello," still lying on his bed. And they say, "So, what do you do?" And he explains what he does. And they say, "So, when do you finish work?" "Oh, in the 1 o'clock." "So, what do you do after that?" "Oh, I just sit here, stare at the ceiling." He said, and they were like, "Wow, so you don't do anything? Like, you just sit here? Imagine what you could do. We have so many ideas. You could build a business, you could make more money, and so on." So he's like, "Okay, go on." So they're like, "You could build this business, make more money." He said, "So what do I do with the money?" He said, "You could buy more land. Okay. Get other people to plow your land. Okay. You could send your kids to the best schools. You could have anything you want. And the more money you make, the bigger the business gets. The bigger the business gets, the more money you make." He was like, "Right. Okay. And then what?" "Oh, and then you have choices and options to do what?" "To just relax, to have a great life." He said, "Stop there. So why would I do all of that if I'm already relaxed and enjoying myself? I'm in peak state already. Go away, go away, go away." And so it made up story, but I can see, and maybe it's real. This is the reality, right? If you're already in a state of bliss, you're already in a state of calm, you're in a state where you feel good about yourself, and lowest levels of stress, not no stress, but no unnecessary cortisol. in your body. And I was doing a presentation earlier today, and I was saying, imagine, visualize that the cortisol is acid. Imagine, just visualize it. It's acid. So you're stressed out, or whatever the stress is. Imagine it's spreading through your body. It's just destroying you, your organs, your nerve endings. And that's how bad it is. It really is that bad, And so I think, to your point, I mean, I just want to take this down another pathway, which is a little bit more pragmatic, to do with Generation Z or Z, depending on if the Americans are watching, American Straight Talk fans are watching as well. So with everything you've said and the story that I've shared, we get it. Tell me a little bit about your understanding of the Gen Z or the Gen Alpha. Like, my kids are 2 and 4. They're the Gen Alpha. We don't even know what they're going to go through. I'm getting ready for it. But the Gen Z have a certain way of behaving. They, to your point, the stress levels, the anxiety levels. I'm sure in your coaching and your counseling, you also work with in the field of addiction, or that you talked about earlier. Tell us more about that, because we don't often consider the sort of support someone needs when they have an addiction. I mean, I would say the mobile phone, I'm not sure if it's come into the categories, the conventional categories, but the mobile phone is an addiction. Let's be honest. You're like a Pavlov's dog, as soon as it goes buzz, you pick it up and you're fully alert on it. And that takes you away from being mindful. Tell me about 2 things. So Gen Z or Gen Z, what's your view of them, and what's the future for them? What should we do to help them? And then a little bit more about this whole area of addiction. I'm very, very interested in that.
Yes. So, and I'll bring those together, because
Yeah,
I've got an example of some really interesting work that a colleague of mine has done. But before I do, I
right.
just want to say I love that story that you told. And also, it's a true story. Um,
Mm,
Helena Norberg Hodge, she visited Ladakh in northern India in the 1970s before it became popular on the tourist trail. And one thing that really struck her was that this was a place where the climate was not exactly conducive to like easy living. They were cut off by snow for long periods of months of the year, and it was harsh, like a harsh life.
mm,
But she was struck by
mm,
high levels of happiness, and she wrote a book called Ancient Futures because she visited
mm,
Ladakh over a 40-year period and sort of followed it up.
mm,
And in that
mm.
time of visiting Ladakh, she saw a rise in depression. She saw suicides happening in young people that was completely unheard of before. She
Mm,
saw, because what was happening was the life that they had, which was really a kind of collective shared experience of supporting each other, followed
mm.
more the Western model of fragmentation, falling apart, people racing against each other, competing against each
Yeah,
other, but also with
yeah,
all of that
yeah,
anxiety. You talked about the acid, the cortisol, it was
yeah.
kind of like a disease. And Oliver James wrote a book called Affluenza. Affluenza is distress related to social or physical appearance. And it's a psychological virus that we can catch. And there's been examples of parts of the world that didn't have television. And when they started having television, they started having higher levels of distress linked to this physical and social appearance. And so the
Right.
social appearance is, am I getting on? Am I getting ahead? I should be higher, I should be climbing up the tree, sort of doing better. So it is happening. And also, what's different about younger people today? I guess one of the things is the media that they consume.
Right.
That
Right.
I remember growing up in a time where, remember colour television coming in for the first time. It was like a big, exciting thing when I was a kid. But if you're growing up with kind of instant availability to, and it's not just availability, but there's something here about the loss of control over truth verification. So you can also be exposed to kind of tidal waves of misinformation that make it very
Yes.
confusing
Yes.
to make sense of things. I think there's a
Yes.
loss of trust in sources of authority, a loss of trust in science, a loss of trust in even that the idea of people talk about the post-truth age, which is incredibly dangerous. Like, how do we navigate in the future if we can't even be taking in the kind of signals that we're getting from scientists about the dangers we're facing? But in
Mm,
terms of what do I know about motivates younger people? A friend of mine was involved in a study looking at how do you help um, young sort of older teenagers who are using high levels of alcohol and drugs. How do you help them discover a different pathway to happiness? And so she set up a positive psychology group teaching psychological strategies to improve mood. And this is the work I've been
Mm,
involved in. It links to my addictions recovery work too, because in a sense, people have chosen chemical pathways to joy that lead to
right.
short-term benefit but long-term cost. And you actually get caught in a
Yeah.
loop where I don't like how I feel, I take this stuff, I feel better, but the effects wear off. But they not only wear off, they amplify the distress. So it's like the
Yeah.
problems go, but they come back with interest. The problems go, but they come back with interest. And you can get hooked on anything that does that instant relief, but long term amplification. And that's
Mm,
also the core problem with our sustainability crisis too, that we're seeking short-term benefits, whether it's the short-term quarterly returns and the bonuses and
mm,
things, but in a way that creates long-term harm. So anyway, my friend
mm.
Miriam Akhtar, she's a well-known positive psychology author, and we've taught together for like a dozen years or so. We run a positive psychology course together. She taught them things like savoring. Now,
Mhm.
savoring. Savoring is where you give your attention to what you like about something. Now you can do this in any room where you can say the first thing is I call it appreciative gaze. Your a gaze is directed by the question, what do I appreciate here? And you can do this. You can look around. You can say, okay, what do I appreciate here? And I'm already looking in your room and actually seeing some of the things that I appreciate as a musician. I love the
Mm,
look of your
mm, mm.
guitar and the picture up
So,
there. But you might have favorite things. So, and if you're watching this, by the way, I'm inviting you to do this too. And what I'm going to suggest is that you look around you for five things you like, love, or appreciate. And when you found five, you just clap like that. Five
mm.
things. So I invite you to this. When you found five things, you clap. And if you found five things, you might do it again. You might go for the double clap, when you get to 10. So you can clap twice when you get to 10, like that. And and
Okay.
and just noticing, I don't know whether you feel exactly the same as 3 minutes ago or different in any way.
I well, I just recognized that there were things in the room that made me feel happy. I knew that anyway. If you were to ask me, is there stuff in that room that made me happy? Yes, I've got my instruments here, and so. But by looking at them again, I gave them. That's where my attention's gone. So I'm like, oh yeah, of course. And it's a reinforcement that wow, I'm grateful that it's here, and yeah, it made me happy looking at them. Yeah, so my
It's
environment felt better.
ah, we can all do this every day. There's a saying that one of the secrets
Mhm.
of happiness is not so much having what you want, it's wanting what you have. And
Yeah,
so,
yeah, that's
and how we feel is influenced by the focus of our attention. I'm not saying that we should only look at the things we love, but actually, what happens is when we give attention to appreciation and gratitude, we
yeah,
nourish ourselves in a way that gives us a stronger starting point to then look at the things that are difficult. It's like we
yeah.
resource ourselves. It's like, how do we have unexpected resilience? This is one of the ways in. We resource ourselves by paying attention to gratitude, and in Active Hope, we guide people through a whole load of gratitude practices. And like, how do we face the mess we're in? The preparation stage of change. We need to get ourselves in a
Right.
more resource
Right.
steady place to then
Yeah,
look at what may be unbearable to look at. But we've
yeah.
kind of we've taken the preparation, and so also there's something here about how do we break free of the constant craving hunger that just wants more and
Mm,
more because it's gobbling up our
mm,
world.
mm.
And one of the
Yeah,
ways we
it is.
do that is by learning how to achieve satiation. Satiation is how do we satisfy our appetites, and it's something about actually appreciating what's there. And what's interesting about this is that actually, I don't know whether you do this, but I do this sometimes. I buy things in excitement, and then I put them away and forget about them. And so
Mm.
it's not even as though I'm getting that much value from some of the things that I spend my money on. But if I focused
Mm.
on wanting what I have, say, well, what have I got in the last year? And how do I really squeeze out the joy from the decisions, the spending choices I've already made? Because what we're doing here,
Yeah.
this is conscious capitalism. It's our having a conscious awareness of where we are, steering our choices that impact on economic behavior. And actually saying, what would it be like if we were to choose consciously to live happily with less? Now, in climate work, there's the model contraction and convergence. So, contraction and
Mm.
convergence is recognizing that in some parts of the world, we emit far too much carbon dioxide. But in other parts of the world, they're struggling even to have some of the basic essential developmental pathways, getting supplies of clean, safe water and food, transport, sufficient heating, safe cooking, and that kind of thing. And so they may need to increase. And so the contraction is what needs to happen in industrialized economies. But convergence is what we need to do, talking about diversity. How do we welcome and create safety for all of our human family on this planet? We live at a
Yeah.
time where hundreds of millions of people are starving. It's kind of like, wow,
Yeah.
and it's so easy to forget. So, contraction of convergence. But if we say you should have less, then the environmental movement just become stealers of joy. But actually, I'm
Mm.
really interested in sustainable happiness. Sustainable
Mm.
happiness is how can you have happiness in the moment that doesn't steal it away from somewhere else in time and space. So
Yeah.
heavy drinking in an evening might bring you joy in that moment, but it might rob happiness from the next day if you end up with a hangover. We can see
Yeah.
that many moments of joy can steal it from somewhere else in our own time. But also, if we have a cheap t-shirt that's basically produced under sweatshop working conditions, then we have the short-term hit, that benefit of happiness, but it's stealing joy away from someone somewhere else in the world. And so sustainable happiness is how do we bring
Mm.
in happiness that is fair to others, but even
Mm.
better, how can we have happiness that has positive ripples through time and space? How do we do something
Mm.
that is enjoyable in the moment but has benefit, like you are doing now? You set
Mm.
up this Straight Talk channel because you wanted to make a difference in some way. You wanted to do some good. It's not just a commercial
Yeah.
enterprise, it's a non-profit that you've
Yeah.
set up. And I'm guessing that you have a feeling I call afterglow. Afterglow is where you have a warm feeling of satisfaction after you've done something you feel good about. And it's well
Yeah, for sure.
deserved. You get that from this
Yeah.
from
Thank
this
you.
channel.
Thank you. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think I every time I have, I mean, I would say I'm somewhat addicted to the experience because, in a positive way, because every time I have these dialogues, like with you, and I had one earlier this week, and then I have some next week. I'm speaking with and engaging with these fantastic minds, their knowledge, their wisdom, and often I do like to interview authors because they've invested their time to study and research a specific area or topic. And it's a privilege to hang out with them for about an hour or so. And not to cover everything, but to that small moment in time, an hour, you're able to then engage in this sort of a dialogue, which is so enriching for me. And then I become the champion and I become the mouthpiece trying to educate many. I have to say, though, that there are not enough of us. There are not enough people out there who are maverick thinkers, who are they accept that they're misfits because they're not the majority, and who understand some of these issues you're raising. I genuinely, and I realized that today and yesterday there was some stuff that happened outside of my world because I've got caught up in my world to such an extent where I only hang around with people like us because we think in this way. We're thinking about like climate realism, diversity economics, the digital world order, the good stuff and the bad stuff, being human. Now, these might sound like, well, that's a great thing to do, but actually a lot of people don't even, they say, I don't have time to think about these, crazy ideas. It's all sort of fantasy. I've just got to get the practical stuff done. I've got to pay my bills, got to go to work, I've got to do my numbers, and then that's it. And I feel quite sad to hear that, and it's funny because I see that the older generation that were actually the instigators of some of this stuff, they essentially have now moved on. Like I said to you earlier on, I've been interviewing people who are, later on in their years, much older. They've now reflected and said, actually, you've got to be more human enough. Tell your Straight Talk community and all the straight talkers to invest in being more human. And that doesn't mean disregard technology or shut it off, but limit it. Because, the more AI you introduce, mobile devices you introduce, the more AR, VR you have, the more it will draw you in, because it is designed very cleverly to draw you in. And we know that through documentaries like The Social Dilemma and various others, where we know that it's no different to a cigarette. I mean, I'm not comparing a cigarette and social media, but in a way, both cause an addiction. And social media is an addiction. And when I ask these people, well, why do you say this is like fantasy? And, you've got the time to do this. Absolutely not. I mean, I engineered my life to do it this way. But they, when I ask them, what do you do then? Like in your free time? I don't have any free time, but what do you do when you finish work? Well, and you start to discover some of them have hobbies like sports or something, or they go out and stuff. But the mobile phone, we know now statistically how many hours we spend on social media apps is their lives, whether it's TikTok or it's, Instagram or it's Tinder, for example, the dating app. That's a whole different discussion around the makeup of a relationship these days and how fickle and superficial it can be. But I think I worry for this generation, and I a little bit, and I'm trying to affect my, the way my children will think about this, who are much younger. I accept being in technology that the virtual world and the metaverse is going to be a reality. I accept that there's going to be much more convenience. I accept technology will overshadow our human lives unless I go out of my way to create some sort of an environment where they don't have devices. I mean, if you look at all of the CEOs of the large technology companies, no surprise, many of them didn't allow their kids to go on social media apps. They protected them. Many of them even limited smartphone time. So because they realize how they've been designed, they realize the net impact of this negative impact over a course of many, many years. So I love what I do, Chris. I think my final few thoughts is related to, I guess, the future now, right? So we've talked about the tough stuff, and I think you've shared that beautifully and articulated it, and it's worrying, no doubt. But I think let's be a little bit more optimistic about this, and let's try and figure out if we had a Harry Potter moment, like you talk about Harry Potter, we had a magic wand opportunity. You had a magic wand opportunity. What would you do? What do you think we should do? Wave your magic wand and things change. What would you do if I gave you that power for 10 minutes?
So I think one of the things is that there's a myth that the way to a better life is having more and more things. And that in a way, you talked about addiction. There is a kind of addiction to stuff that is killing our world. And so what I would do is I would throw my life into the story of recovery. And I would live that recovery. And we talk about recovery from this or that. People might recover from different things. But if we're holding the question, what is it we recover towards? Every change has two directions. There's what you're moving away from and there's what you're moving towards. What is it that we want to move towards? And there is a better way. And so I think of this sustainable happiness, the great turning. It's like, okay, what is it we want to turn towards? What is it we deeply want? And in addictions recovery, I found so helpful the idea of find the want behind the should. We're not saying, should, you must cut down your carbon emissions in a way that can feel all kind of controlling and restrictive. We're actually saying, no, there's a better way here. And I'm developing a kind of a well-being practice called Suha. Suha stands for sustainable happiness, and it's kind of like a playful martial art. And so when you
Hmm.
encounter kind of difficult feelings or difficult experience, you kind of take them in a kind of Tai Chi kind of way, but you also give a response that's actually
Right.
pushing back and offering back and supporting well-being. And so in terms of what would I do is like, well, it's what I'm doing. I put myself behind active hope, behind Suha, behind well-being, and actually look at how do we learn ways to have better lives that are also good for our world. And the term I use for this is the
Mm.
beautiful life. A beautiful life is good for you and it's also good for other people in the world. How do we live that way
Right.
and we make that the default setting? Now, you said at the moment
Mm.
there's not so many people, but that's been true of every major social movement in history. And
True.
there's
True.
a understanding of social diffusion, how ideas spread, that you tend to get early adopters, and this is the same with tech change too. Early adopters, maybe about 15% of the population, get very interested in something early. But what they do is that they find a way to make it work in a way that
Sure.
then the early majority, which might be another 35% of people, begin
Yeah.
to catch on and experiment with. And once
Yeah.
they do, you reach a tipping point where a late majority will say, hey, I'm interested in this too. And you can plot that sequence of all kinds of changes in our world. And there might be 15% of people who are resistant right to the last, who never quite get it.
Mm.
And I wouldn't spend a lot of time arguing with them. But so I can kind of think, I'm with you. I'm with you here and now. Our magic
Mm.
wand is to explore for ourselves as early adopters, saying, could there be a better way? Let's research
Mm.
it, let's find it. And when we find it, we bring it back to the community and we say, hey, this here, the group I mentioned
Mm.
earlier, the young hoodies using high levels of alcohol and drugs, their alcohol consumption, drug consumption really fell when they found other ways of finding joy and positive emotions other than drink or drug use. And that was what my work
Mm.
was in the addictions recovery world too. And someone I know in recovery, he said, I didn't just give up drinking, I threw it away. What would it
Right.
be like if we found something that was so much better than what the kind of capitalism model, whatever we want to call it, the consumer worldview offered people? It was so much better that actually we say, yeah, this is what we want.
Mm.
And so our
Mm.
job is like if we find that in the places we do find it, and that's what I do. I set up an online college called collegeofwellbeing.com. I set up a
Right.
free online course at activehope.training. It's another website where I guide
Okay.
people through the stuff in the book through a whole series of videos. There's about 9 hours of video. It's released in weekly
Wow.
installments. Just go to activehope.training and you get like a little dollop of videos every week that you guide people through a process designed to strengthen our capacity to act for positive change in the world. And if we grow the
Fantastic.
skills, it's like this is a much better game to play. I could do Space Invaders, I could engage in these things, and I've got one of these VR masks, and it's great fun. But actually, there's a real game, a real emergency. It's much more meaningful. Because what a lot of these computer games do is they try and lure people into a story that seems meaningful. But actually, real
Mm.
life can be much more meaningful, and we can discover
Mm.
the things at home that are the real
Mm.
treasures.
Mm. Mm. Absolutely. I'm so bought into what you're saying, and it's refreshing to and gratifying to hear what you're saying, because it's, this requires many of us to come together to shake up a system. It's not going to be easy, that's for sure, and we may have to be patient. And how patient, I don't know, because I don't know what the catastrophic impacts will be of hanging tight and not being radical enough. Yet, I do feel hopeful about the fact that, at least in the West, having studied the East, especially places like India, where I'm originally from, that there is an awakening I see in the West that we've never seen before, and a sense of awareness. If in fact the work you're doing is a byproduct of that, where spirituality and yoga and understanding the consciousness understanding deeds, values. Maybe religion gave some of that. Religion's eroded now, and people don't go to the holy sort of the temple or the church as much as they used to. That's another topic of discussion. And whilst I'm not either for or against religion, it did give you a sense of good and bad, and it made you a little bit conscious of the fact that, oh my God, I haven't given, or I have not been ethical, or I haven't been right. So, there was an element of that. Now that's eroded, there's no replacement for it, really. And I think, in a way, the replacement is all of these teachings, authors like you, and others who are writing these fantastic books that are about issues that are real, resilience, uncertainty, hope, the great turning, beautiful life, and so on. And that creates that sense, it's a positive aura. It's like a light as opposed to the darkness, where you think, actually, there are people who have a way forward, like some form of salvation, right? And it doesn't have to be drugs, and it doesn't have to be chemicals, and it doesn't have to be me going down this pathway, where actually there is this amazing world that exists up in that world. That's what it's about. I mean, StraightTalk is about accelerating knowledge and awareness to over 1 million people. I want to get this to over 1 million people for free. So even if you watch 10 minutes of something once in your life, hopefully a minute of the 10 minutes will make you think a little bit differently about who you are and what you stand for. You've done exactly that today, Chris, and I thank you for coming on the show. And, we could talk for hours, and I really hope one day we'll meet face to face, not just in the virtual environment, because there's so much I'd like to get involved in with you and help you with your cause, equally seek your support and counsel and what we're trying to do with StraightTalk and some of the other nonprofit work that I'm doing. So thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really hope you've enjoyed it. It's been a good use of your hour. And, with that in mind, I would love some initial reactions, some feedback perhaps as to how it's been for you today, some words that we'll take on board and live by and do better with as well.
So what the words that come up for me is common purpose.
Yeah.
I feel common purpose with you. It's a real pleasure to meet you, to be alongside you. And if we, it improves our lives when we have a sense of common purpose. And there's this big challenge, okay, how to face the mess we're in. Just number one is to acknowledge we are facing a mess. And if you find yourself all shaken up by that, then that shows that you've noticed, and it shows that you care. But then becomes the story about how do we prepare ourselves? How do we strengthen our capacity to find and play our part? And we need to have training. We need to kind of train each other. We need to seek out the sources of inspiration, the tools, learning, the allies, the capacities, the skills, the strategies that will help us. And that's what you're doing. You're scouring the world. You're kind of saying, okay, who's got something to offer? Let me give you some space. I'd love to hear what you have to say. And so I just want to say thank you. Thank you for your good work.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. It's my pleasure. And thank you for coming on the show. We've enjoyed it thoroughly. Where can people find you? I know if you don't mind just repeating the websites again, just so people can make a note.
So I have two main areas of work. One is around personal well-being, but also personal and collective well-being at collegeofwellbeing.com. And I've got this course in SUHA training, sustainable happiness training. I've got a course in listening skills that begins next week. So I do kind of all kinds of work around different aspects of well-being, positive psychology, resilience. And then I also do work more around what helps us face the mess we're in collectively in our planet time that we're in now, climate change, mass extinction, vast inequality. And that's at activehope.info is about the book. activehope.training is a free online course.
Excellent. Great. Hopefully everyone's noted that down. We'll share that in the email that goes out and the newsletter that goes out later as well. Thank you very much, Chris. It's been amazing. For our StraightTalk viewers, if you're watching the show, click on the right there for subscription of this channel and the bell as well, so you're notified of when the next episode is released. Thank you again. Have a wonderful year ahead, a wonderful week ahead, a wonderful day ahead. We shall keep in touch and maybe have you back for your next book, or when you release your next book. Is there a plan to do that maybe at some point?
I'm developing the online training. That's my focus now. But yes, I've got
Okay.
some ideas, and I'd love to tell you about them when they're more developed.
Yeah, wonderful. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you, Chris Johnstone, the author of Active Hope. Go out there, buy the book. We'll post this out on social media. Be well, take care, good night, good morning if it's morning for you, and of course, good afternoon. Looking forward to the next show. Be well, may the force be with you.